When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Kremlin sold the world an image of a relentless war machine, endless tanks, limitless shells, and an army that could grind forward no matter the cost. Nearly 4 years later, the picture looks very different. Russia is still dangerous, still capable of inflicting enormous damage, but the costs of this war are eating into the very foundations that keep that war machine running. Tonight, we're going to unpack what that means in real terms: manpower, equipment, industry, foreign support, and political will. Because when analysts say Russia's war machine is running out of steam, they don't mean Moscow is about to collapse tomorrow. They mean that every kilometre of territory, every day of offensive operations is now bought at a price that is becoming harder and harder for Russia to sustain over time. Let's start with the simplest fuel of any war machine: people. Independent counts using open source data paint a staggering picture. By late 2025, Russian officers killed in Ukraine numbered over 6,000 out of nearly 150,000 Russian soldiers and contractors whose deaths have been documented by name. Researchers behind these projects stress that this is likely only a fraction of the real toll. When they extrapolate from the data, some estimates put total Russian military deaths in the hundreds of thousands, with overall casualties, killed and wounded, approaching or exceeding 1 million. These are not abstract figures. They translate into emptied villages, missing fathers, and a generation of men either at the front or permanently out of the workforce. Analysts who have cross-checked cemetery records, probate documents, and local obituaries estimate that as many as 0.5% to 1.2% of all Russian men under 60 may already have been killed. Against that backdrop, one senior British commander offered a blunt assessment of the human cost of this war. General Sir Roland Walker said there are no winners in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It is an utter devastation for both sides. Russia has tried to plug those losses by recruiting from poorer regions, mobilizing reservists, and even sending convicts to the front on short-term contracts. Each of those steps keeps the war machine moving, but none of them are free. They erode social trust, deepen regional inequalities, and create a long tail of traumatized veterans who will return to a society already under strain. Over time, that is what running out of steam looks like. Not a sudden stop, but a grinding depletion of the human base that keeps the army going. Now, look at the hardware. Russia went to war with one of the world's largest tank fleets. By late 2025, Ukrainian tallies, while contested by Moscow, claimed that more than 11,000 Russian tanks and over 23,000 armoured fighting vehicles had been destroyed, damaged or captured. Even allowing for propaganda and double counting, independent analysts broadly agree that Russia has lost a massive share of its modern armour and has been forced to drag older Soviet-era vehicles out of storage to keep units filled. As those older vehicles roll forward, the quality gap becomes obvious. A researcher who has tracked Russia's armour losses described the pace of destruction in stark terms. Nikolai Mitrokhin warned that armoured vehicles are being put out of use with a horrifying speed. What does that speed mean on the battlefield? It means new brigades arriving with mismatched equipment. It means crews trained on one system suddenly fighting in another. It means more breakdowns, more maintenance bottlenecks, and more lives lost because vehicles lack modern protection against drones and artillery. And it means Russia has to spend far more just to stand still. The ammunition story is even more revealing. Artillery is the backbone of Russia's way of war. In 2022 and 2023, Russian batteries often fired 10 times more shells than their Ukrainian counterparts. Western intelligence estimated that Russia expended 10 to 11 million artillery rounds in a single year, a rate no peacetime factory system was designed to sustain. Russia responded by ramping up its defense industry, declaring a war economy and pouring money and manpower into munitions plants. By some accounts, Moscow now produces more artillery shells annually than the United States and Europe combined, and has massively increased output of tanks, armoured vehicles and drones. On paper, that sounds like anything but a war machine running out of steam, but there are two problems. First, Russia is burning through those shells almost as fast as it can make them. A Western official summarized the imbalance bluntly. One Western official said, Russia lacks sufficient domestic ammunition production to meet its needs in its war on Ukraine. In other words, even after doubling or tripling production, Russia is still struggling to keep up with the rate at which its guns are firing. Every offensive that relies on heavy barrages drains the stockpiles again. That is why Russia has had to look abroad for help. Which brings us to the second problem, dependence on fragile partners. North Korea has become a critical external fuel line for Russia's war machine. Western and Ukrainian intelligence estimate that Pyongyang has supplied millions of artillery shells, in some assessments up to 40 to 60% of the shells fired by Russian forces at certain points in the war. Investigations using satellite imagery and shipping data suggest that more than 15,000 containers, potentially over 6 million shells and rockets, have crossed from North Korea to Russia in the last couple of years, allowing Moscow to maintain high rates of fire even when its own factories were still ramping up. But that external lifeline is also under strain. Ukrainian military intelligence now says Pyongyang has had to cut back shipments, with the volume of shells delivered to Russia falling by more than half in 2025, as North Korea's own stockpiles show signs of exhaustion and the quality of ammunition deteriorates. The picture that emerges is not of a confident, self-sufficient military power, but of a war machine that needs constant external transfusions simply to keep operating at its current level. If those flows slow, whether because of sanctions, domestic needs in North Korea, or pressure from other countries, the strain on Russia's own industry will grow. Meanwhile, sanctions and battlefield losses are reshaping Russia's defense sector in ways that are less visible but equally important. A detailed study by a leading policy institute describes Russia's military industry as being in regression despite record spending, forced to simplify designs, accept lower quality components, and sacrifice innovation in order to churn out large quantities of relatively basic weapons. That matters because modern war is not just about how many shells you can fire. It's about the quality of your precision munitions, your electronic warfare, your communications, and your drones. Russia has made huge strides in some of these areas, particularly in cheap attack drones and jamming systems, but it is doing so under severe technological constraints, cut off from many Western components and forced to improvise with less efficient substitutes. On the battlefield, all of this translates into a kind of grinding momentum rather than rapid breakthroughs. Russian forces have managed to advance in key sectors, and especially around heavily contested hubs in eastern Ukraine, but often at enormous cost in men and materiel. Independent military monitors tracking the front line describe how months of costly assault operations have produced gains measured in kilometers, not tens or hundreds of kilometers. For Ukraine, this has been devastating. Cities like Ternopil and others have been hit by long-range missile strikes, killing dozens of civilians at a time, even as Russian troops continue pushing on the ground. But for Russia, too, the pace is punishing. Western assessments suggest that at various points in 2024 and 2025, Russian forces were suffering around 1,000 casualties a day, killed or wounded, in Ukraine. Ukrainian and Western intelligence agencies say that to keep units at the front supplied, Russia is now recruiting roughly 50,000 to 60,000 new troops every month, a figure that includes volunteers, contract soldiers, and mobilized reservists. Those recruitment numbers are extraordinary. They are also a sign of how much strain the system is under. Every month that the war continues at this tempo, Russia has to find another small city's worth of men willing or forced to go to the front. Inside Russia, the shift to a war economy has brought jobs and higher wages in some defense-related sectors. The arms industry now employs millions and accounts for a huge share of manufacturing work. Yet this boom is built on unsustainable foundations, heavy state subsidies, diverted resources, and long-term damage to other parts of the economy. Analysts warn that Russia will increasingly have to choose between funding civilian needs and maintaining its current level of war spending. Sanctions add another layer. While they have clearly not stopped Russia from producing weapons, in some areas production is higher than ever, they have forced Moscow to pay more, accept lower quality, and rely on smuggling networks and partners like Iran and North Korea. That makes the system more fragile, more exposed to disruption, and less able to adapt. All of this raises a bigger question. If Russia's war machine is under such pressure, why is it still advancing in places? Why haven't these strains translated into a clear military collapse? The answer is uncomfortable for Ukraine and its supporters. Russia's war machine may be running out of steam relative to its original ambitions. The idea of quickly subjugating Ukraine and dictating terms is gone, but it is still powerful enough to grind forward against an opponent that is short of ammunition, air defences and manpower. Recent analyses warn that Ukraine itself is teetering in several sectors, with exhausted soldiers and delayed Western aid, giving Russia more room to press its advantages, despite its own huge losses. In other words, two things can be true at the same time. Russia's war machine is weaker, more brittle, and more dependent on risky foreign support than it was at the start of the war. And yet it remains capable of doing enormous damage, especially if Ukraine does not receive enough support to hit back. So what does running out of steam really look like in the months and years ahead? It looks like offensives that take longer, cost more, and rely increasingly on massed infantry assaults and cheap drones instead of sophisticated combined arms maneuver. It looks like a growing gap between the Kremlin's political goals, controlling large swathes of Ukraine, pressuring NATO, reshaping Europe's security order, and what its military can realistically achieve on the ground without absorbing even greater losses. It looks like increasing reliance on countries such as North Korea, whose own capacity to supply shells appears to be faltering, and on an industrial base that researchers say will likely face innovation stagnation as it sacrifices research and development for sheer volume. And it looks like a Russian society that, while not on the brink of revolt, is slowly being reshaped by the war. More militarized, more dependent on defense jobs, more used to the sight of fresh graves and wounded veterans, and more locked into a conflict that is increasingly hard to end on favorable terms. There is one more element to consider, the psychological and political dimension. For the Kremlin, admitting that the war machine is under strain would be politically dangerous. Instead, Russian leaders emphasize new factories, record production, and plans to increase drone and missile output many times over. President Vladimir Putin said Russia diversified its defense industry by strengthening production capacities and improving military technology, while promising that the defense sector can keep pace with the demands of the front. On the surface, those statements project confidence, but they also reveal anxiety. You do not need to reassure your public and your troops about production unless everyone can see how fast you are burning through equipment. You do not double or triple output in key categories unless losses are forcing you to. In the end, the phrase running out of steam is less about a single dramatic turning point and more about trajectory. Russia's war machine is still running, but it is running harder, paying more, and taking greater risks just to keep moving. It is drawing on deeper social and economic reserves, leaning on partners like North Korea, and sacrificing long-term technological progress for short-term battlefield needs. That creates an opportunity and a warning at the same time. For Ukraine and its backers, the opportunity is clear. If they can sustain their own support, disrupt Russia's fragile supply chains, and exploit the vulnerabilities in its manpower and industry, they can make this war even more costly for Moscow and limit its ability to launch future large-scale offensives. For Russia, the warning is equally stark. The longer the war drags on, the more its war machine risks becoming a heavy, exhausted engine, still dangerous, still capable of surging forward in bursts, but increasingly running on fumes. And somewhere along that trajectory, even the most powerful machine can find that simply continuing to move has become its biggest strategic defeat.